Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Professor Myers, I'll start with you. Would you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your area of expertise is, and what you mean when you say that you're a religious pluralist, and how that informs your thinking about evil and suffering in the world?
Yeah, sure. Welcome, everyone. The initial speaker said that you were going to hear from a Christian intellectual. I'm not sure if that's him or me, but you guys can all decide that, I guess. I'm here, I guess, to represent the position of religious pluralism. Not totally happy with the word, but it seems to be the word that represents what I'm about. But I did write a thesis on the problem of evil as a master's student at Gonzaga University in 1981. It was called Confessions of a Free Will Defender, an Analytic Theodicy. So from that title you can see sort of the root of my commitments in free will, and also an analytic tradition, and a theodicy, or a solution to the problem of evil. I may have moved somewhat from that position, but I still kind of stand by it. But I think that what I should probably do is define religious pluralism for you, and speak for a moment to how that might have some insights into the problem of suffering, and also the problem of evil, that is, whether there could be an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God at the same time that there is evil in the world. So first I would like to say that religious pluralism is not a dogmatic metaphysics holding a closed set of claims about the universe. So there's no single set of claims, I think, that any particular religious pluralist has to hold about the universe. But rather, at least I think of religious pluralism as a practical response to the fact of religious diversity. It's just the fact that there are many different people in the world that hold different religious beliefs or attitudes toward religion generally. So as a religious pluralist, what I try to do is inquire into the creative insights that are given in all of the world's different religious traditions. And I think that all of the world's religious traditions do offer creative insights, but at the same time reject any claims that are inconsistent with human life and flourishing. So no matter what the tradition, whether it's Christianity or Judaism, Buddhism or Hinduism, or one of the smaller traditions, Islam is the last large one, but any number of the smaller traditions, I think a religious pluralist not only upholds the truths that are in those different religions, but also rejects the falsehoods that might be found in them. In regard to sort of the debate or polarized structure tonight, I agree with the first introducer that said that it's not a debate. For one thing, religious pluralism is not really a category that's in competition with any particular religion. If you ask a person what religion they are, they cannot say I'm a religious pluralist, because a religious pluralist is not a member of a religion in so far as they are a religious pluralist. One could be, for example, a Christian pluralist, a Jewish pluralist, or an atheist pluralist. What I do hold is that all of the world's religious traditions that I am familiar with have examined the topic of suffering, and they've all had important things to say about that. While the theistic traditions of Hinduism and the religions of the book, I would use that as shorthand for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, while these religions have wrestled with great theodicies or solutions to the problem of evil, non-theistic religions like Buddhism and Jainism have also made the end of suffering a central concern. And as our questioning goes on, I hope to share with you a little bit more about how those approaches might work. So that kind of sets it up for my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Ray, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of expertise and what you mean when you say that you're a Christian and how that impacts your view of evil and suffering in the world?
Sure. Christianity comes in various flavors. As in the case of just about any deep, rich worldview. I'm a Christian of the Protestant flavor. I go to a Christian Reformed church. That's a very small denomination of Dutch Calvinists, basically. Some of you are thinking, what's a Calvinist? Some of you may be thinking, what's a Christian? I'm not even going to bother to try to explain what Calvinism is. Christianity, basically, here's what I take the nuts and bolts of Christianity to be, for any who might not know. I believe that there's a personal God who created the universe and who created human creatures for the sake of enjoying a relationship with God. I believe that human sin and brokenness is an obstacle to that relationship, and that God became incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, that Jesus lived a perfect life, and then suffered and died on a cross, and then rose again, somehow all for the sake of repairing our relationship with God, for removing the obstacle that we face to having a relationship with God, and also somehow for the sake of restoring all of creation from its fallen state. That's sort of the belief background to Christianity. Being a Christian, I think, involves partly believing these truths, and usually some others too, and trying to live out your life somehow in light of those truths. I guess for me, I take it to be trying to live my life in a way that is sort of ever increasingly approximating a life that proceeds in gratitude for what Jesus has done, and is, takes seriously the love that God has for all creatures and for creation. It takes seriously the idea that God actually wants somehow to relate to me, and that that's a great good for me. And that takes seriously the idea that God's plan for human beings as revealed in the Bible is actually a good plan, and the plan that we're supposed to live in accord with. That's what Christianity comes to at a very basic level for me. Was there more you wanted to hear?
I think that's good.
All right.
So as I said, there are three kind of themes that we want to talk about tonight. The first concerns suffering that comes from the workings of the natural world, and then we're going to talk about evil as a result of human actions, and then finally we're going to talk a bit about finding meaning and purpose in a world where suffering exists. So we're going to start with suffering from the natural world. Human suffering takes a variety of forms, from physical pain to psychological trauma. It has a variety of causes, which can include anything from an accidental or natural cause to being injured in a car crash or being born with a debilitating disease. So I'd like to start by inviting each of our speakers to talk about natural suffering and how that fits with their perspective on the world. So Professor Myers, if you would, I'll give you the first question. Many people would argue that the quantity of suffering in the human experience is evidence that we cannot be the creation of a loving God. So would you agree with that perspective? Do you see the quantity of suffering as evidence against the loving Creator?
Okay, so I take this to be the question about natural evil, because suffering not resulting from intentional human action is often called in philosophy natural evil. So I think that it's important first to distinguish between some different levels of suffering or pain. So some suffering may lead to a greater good. For example, pain receptors in the fingertips may give one a painful sensation, while allowing one to withdraw from a situation where one could possibly be badly burned. So if you don't have pain receptors in your fingers, you're in some danger. So that would be good to have pain feeling through your fingers so that you can do that, get out of a bad situation. The question, though, really arises on whether or not there's pain or suffering that doesn't have a point. Sometimes this is called pointless suffering, or what the philosopher John Hick called it is dysteleological suffering or dysteleological evil. Teleology means the goal or the point. Dis means not, so dysteleological suffering would be suffering that doesn't really seem to have a point. And I would have to say that as I've passed through life to this point, I do think that we ought to recognize that there could be such a thing as dysteleological suffering, or suffering that doesn't really seem to have a point. That's not to say that we might not be able to recognize the point to it at some future time, but I think it's really hard to try to argue that all suffering has somehow a point to it. So that would be my position on that.
Okay. And Professor Ray, I'd like to pose the same question to you. How would you respond to the argument that the sheer quantity of natural suffering militates against the view of a loving God?
I'm inclined to agree that if God exists, there's no pointless suffering. I think that the question is whether we have evidence that there's pointless suffering. If we do, if we can look out at the world, find some suffering, and feel really confident that there is absolutely no point to it, it does not serve any greater good, it could not serve any greater good, then I think we have some evidence against the existence of God. So I'm prepared to grant that much to people who sort of raise the problem of evil as a reason for rejecting belief in God. The difficulty is figuring out why we should think that we're in a position to declare that some particular instance of suffering has no point, could have no point, could not possibly be justified by any greater good. Here I'm borrowing an example from sort of an old paper, but suppose you walk into a classroom where they're speaking a foreign language, and it's a language that you don't know, it's a language you've never encountered, you just hear them speaking this stuff, and you walk in and you think, I don't recognize anything meaningful going on in there. You say, well, pretty clearly nothing meaningful is taking place in this room. That's sort of absurd. You're not in a position to tell whether there's anything meaningful taking place in that room. We would say, you don't even know the language, you don't even know what the language is. These might be meaningless sounds, they might not be. You're simply not in a position to tell, right? And this is the response to the problem of evil that I favor. We're simply not in a position to tell whether the evils that we encounter have a point or could have a point. If they have a point, it's likely going to be something vastly beyond our comprehension. We're working with a 3-pound piece of meat between our ears, right? If sufferings like the Holocaust, or even just sufferings like the intense suffering of a small child, who's coming from an abusive upbringing or something like that, if these sufferings, if the permission of these sufferings is somehow justified by greater goods, what reason do we think that we would have What reason do we have to think that we would have access to those greater goods? None. God, according to the Christian tradition, God is omniscient, right? God knows everything. God can see connections between things that we can't even begin to fathom. And so the idea that we could sort of walk in and look at an instance of suffering and say, nothing could possibly justify the permission of this, it is presumptuous on our part. It presupposes that we have access to a range of goods and a range of connections between suffering and potential goods that we can't possibly have access to. I mean, there are two ways of asking the question about evil. You might ask whether the existence of evil absolutely rules out the possibility that God exists. I think the answer to that question is clearly no. There's simply no good logical argument for the conclusion that God can't possibly exist in a universe in which there's suffering. The reason is, again, for all we know, there might be a morally sufficient reason for permitting the suffering. The other way of asking the question is to ask whether the existence of suffering, or the existence of suffering in the kinds and the amounts that we find in this world, somehow count against the existence of God, even if it doesn't prove the non-existence of God. And here I think to say that it counts against the existence of God, you have to be able to say that you're in a position to be able to tell whether these evils would have a point. And if you come to the realization that you're in no position to be able to tell that the goods that might justify these sufferings are totally beyond your ken, then there's nowhere else to go, right? There's no way to make the argument.
So as you may be able to tell, I have a prepared script, but I'm also allowed to ask follow-up questions. I don't want to get us too bogged down, so what I'm going to do is suggest a follow-up question that one of you might want to ask. And that is whether either of our conversation partners would be willing to speculate. Right? So Dr. Ray has just indicated that we're not necessarily in a good position to know what goods may sort of counterbalance the suffering we see in the world. But surely we can speculate. So one of you might want to ask either or both of our conversation partners to speculate on what goods might come from the existence of natural evil in the world, natural suffering in the world. Okay, the second major question that we want to invite both of our speakers to talk about is concerns the existence of what we might call evil, which would be bad things that are the result of malicious, intentional behavior by human beings, by moral agents. So I'll start with Dr. Ray this time. Dr. Ray, how does the human capacity for evil fit with a Christian account of who and what human beings are?
I guess there are two ways to take that question. One is, what do we know about human beings that leads us to think that they might be the sorts of beings who are capable of great evil? The other way to take the question, I guess, is as just another instance of the question that we just talked about, right? Why think that a perfectly good God would create creatures with the capacity for evil that that we've manifested throughout human history? On the first way of taking the question, so I said at the beginning that I think human beings are created to be in a relationship with God. I also think that human beings were created free. We were free to choose a relationship with God or to reject it. We were free to obey God or to sin. And God has made us with a lot of remarkable abilities. And according to the Christian story, human beings at the very beginning of it all exercised their free choice in the direction of sin. And given all the great abilities that God has created us with, it pretty much stands to reason that if we're going to move in the direction of sinning, especially over time, we will get better and better and better at it. And we will improve our skills at causing one another to suffer, and we will improve our skills at causing creation to suffer, and we will manifest a terrific capacity for evil. I think all of that is just sort of built into the basic idea that God created us in God's image and also gave us the freedom to choose between a relationship with God and obedience to God on the one hand, and being outside of a relationship with God and sort of going our own way on the other hand. So that's an answer, I guess, to the first way of taking the question that was just asked. As to the second way of taking the question, how could a perfectly loving God permit human beings to do evil in the ways that we have done? Here I want to give basically the same response that I gave a few minutes ago. Fundamentally, I don't know. And so the natural follow-up question is, well, if you don't know, then why do you keep worshiping this God, right? Why don't you suspend judgment for a while? I mean, after all, look around at the world. Haven't lots of really smart people come to the conclusion that the world is just kind of a sick joke, or that the world is governed not by a perfectly good deity, but by a capricious deity, or maybe even by a bad deity, or something like that? And the answer to this question, again, is part of it, and it's important that this is only part of it, but part of it is what I just said, namely, I don't take myself to be in a position to be able to tell whether the suffering I find serves absolutely no point. And then the other part of it, which is just as important, is that the Christian story otherwise makes a whole lot of sense out of my experience of the world. Any deep, rich, interesting worldview is going to have problems. You cannot find a single worldview in the marketplace of ideas that doesn't have serious, at least superficial objections that could be raised against it. And the problem of evil is the challenge for Christianity. It's one of maybe 2 or 3 really good challenges for Christianity. But what everyone does, everyone who has a worldview, what they do in the face of serious challenges is, some give up their worldview, but plenty persist in the worldview because the worldview makes a whole lot of sense out of the rest of their experience, and they continue to work and try to figure out how to reconcile the, what you might call the anomaly with the worldview itself, right? So in the case of Christianity, like I said, I don't think that the existence of evil is absolutely incompatible with the existence of God. I think that in principle there could be a morally sufficient reason for permitting the evil that we see in the world. And when I recognize my own limitations as compared with the vast intellect that God is supposed to have and to be, I see that I'm simply not in a position to say this world could not be the handiwork of a God like Christians worship.
Professor Myers, as a religious pluralist, what do you make of the fact that human beings are capable of terrible evil? And as a corollary question, in your framework, how would you distinguish between good and evil?
Okay, I'll start out with the second question there, my basic framework, and then I'll come back to the question of moral evil, and also try to respond a little bit to a couple of things that Professor Ray said. Okay, so first, while I do not discount divine command moral theory, I do think that pluralist inquiry shows that systems of morality can be generated separately from any particular religious tradition or text. So I don't think that Christians, for example, have sort of a corner on the moral market, even given the basic goodness of the Christian Bible and the Christian tradition. There's quite a few arguments that are given, even by Christian philosophers that I know of, that argue that ethics has a kind of autonomy. In China, for example, with no links to any of the texts that are associated with any of the great religious traditions, there arose a great debate over the human capacity for good and evil. Mencius, who was a follower of Confucian philosophy, emphasized the capacity for good, and he made it a principle of government that the leader who governs most effectively is the person who cannot bear to see the suffering of others. He said that if you have a leader that cannot bear to see the suffering of others, then it's as easy to rule the empire as it is to roll a ball around in the palm of one's hand. So that seems to me to be a sound principle having to do with moral goodness and moral evil, which grows out of a non-Christian tradition. I think Mencius was right. It's a useful and easily applied principle that, if adopted, would quickly change the world for the good. Now, in response a little bit to what Professor Ray was saying, I think that he gave a really excellent and succinct view of the Christian response to the problem of evil. And he gave it really in terms of David Hume's two-pronged objections. The first objection was that evil somehow logically is incompatible with an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God. And Professor Ray said that he believed that that doesn't logically follow. And I think that that's correct. I think that it doesn't logically follow. However, I might part ways a little bit with Professor Ray on the second part of Hume's charge, which is that does evil, moral and or natural evil, sort of give us a force that would count against an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God? Now, I'm not really willing to go out on a limb here and say that it counts against it, but I am willing to question a little bit this idea of, I guess it's called skeptical theism, and that is that we're not in a position to make a judgment of God's ways, and we ought to allow that an omniscient mind might be able to see a redeeming value in suffering that human beings themselves do not see. So the question really of the logic of the problem of evil boils down to the question of whether or not God would have a morally sufficient reason to allow instances of suffering. And Professor Ray stated this language of having a morally sufficient reason. I think that originally comes from Nelson Pike, but Eleanor Stump uses it. It's very good language that clearly gets to the problem. But what I think the proper response is, if one is going to adopt the view of the theist, is that one ought to contend with God over the problem of moral and natural evil. In other words, I don't think we really sort of have the right to sort of sit back and say, okay, God, it's fine, you do what you think you ought to do because you're great and mighty. I think rather that we should be a little bit more like Job, at least in the main part of the book of Job. Job caves a little bit at the end of the book. But for the most part, Job is contending with God. And I think that this, again, shows sort of insights from more than one religious tradition, because Job is a Jewish book. It comes from the Hebrew part of the scriptures, and actually Job is a story that actually goes beyond the boundaries. There's also an Islamic version of the book of Job as well. And I think that really the Jewish insight into the problem of evil from this perspective is that one contends with God. In other words, one says, one asks God, hey, what's the deal with that? And I really think that that's sort of the duty of a theist, is to say to God, you know, we've got the Shoah, the Holocaust, given to us as a fact, you know, of the 20th century. Hey God, what's the deal with that? So I'm pretty much, I think, in agreement with Professor Ray on, you know, our inability to preclude God's existence because there's evil in the world. But I do think that we owe it to ourselves and to a God who would be worthy of worship to say, hey, what's the deal with that?
Can I respond to this real quick?
Sure can, yeah.
I want to say, I mean, I guess in a certain way, maybe you didn't totally hope to have us just agree with one another, but, and I mean, there are plenty of things that we disagree about, but I want to affirm this idea of contending with God, because I think that it's affirmed in Scripture. So I guess I want to say two things here. First, the response that I gave to the question about whether the existence of evil counts against the existence of God is an intellectual response to people who are coming along saying, hey, you cannot sensibly continue to believe in this God because you have evidence, indeed overwhelming evidence, against the existence of this God. And the response to that, I think, is this two-pronged response that I've just been giving. First, A, there is no deductive proof of God's non-existence that can be had, starting with the premise that there's evil in the world. And B, we are simply not in a position to count the evil that we see around us as strong evidence against God's existence. By and large, this is not the most pastorally useful response to what most of us actually struggle with when we deal with the problem of evil. The last time I taught the problem of evil in a class, it started the day after a Notre Dame student had died. He was filming football practice on a crane, and the crane blew over in high wind, and it killed the student. The next day, I was supposed to start talking about the problem of evil in class. What the students did not need to hear was, here is why the existence of pain, suffering, and evil does not logically count against the existence of God. What they need to hear is, well, the way they phrase the question is, why does God permit this, right? To which, of course, the answer is, I don't know. But a lot of the point of the question is, as Professor Myers is saying, to contend with God over this, right? And this is something, in Scripture, Job contends with God, right? Professor Myers said Job caves at the end. That's not how I understand the response. My wife is a Job scholar. Job's response to God is notoriously difficult to translate. But the overall picture that I like from Job is one that has Job coming to God saying, why am I suffering like this? Haven't I lived a good life? And come on, I want an audience with God because I'm in a lot of pain. And God comes and speaks from the whirlwind and says, brace yourself like a man, I will question you and you will answer me. But then, contrary to what a lot of people say, God doesn't just flex his muscles and display divine power and say, now be quiet. God shows Job who God is, and Job sees that, and though he can't articulate an answer to the question why God permitted evil, Job sees God sort of in the way you might see, a boyfriend or girlfriend who you suspected of having betrayed you, but you just see them now and you just realize that couldn't have been the case, right? Job sees God and realizes, okay, somehow you're good, right? That's the interpretation of Job that I favor. Job isn't the only place where people contend with God over suffering. I'm working through the book of Lamentations right now, and this is a book that begins with no hope and ends with no hope, shows a little bit of hope in the middle and then squashes it. It in the room, go read the book of Lamentations and ask yourself what it means to do as we would do in my church if that were read out from the pulpit, to read those verses and afterwards say, this is the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. It's hard to know what to do with that, but one takeaway lesson is God somehow owns that suffering. The perspective that cries out to God and says, why, pay attention. This is what goes on in Lamentations. Pay attention, God. Listen, look at the suffering going on. Pay attention. Why are you coming at us? God puts that right there in Scripture and lets it be in all its rawness. So this whole business of contending with God, I think that's important. But when you contend with God, you are contending with God. You're no longer in the position of someone who's saying, I've got no evidence that you exist, right? You're contending with God.
So I wonder if I could pose a follow-up that is open to either of you. Is there an analog for us today of seeing God, as Dr. Ray, you're suggesting Job does at the end of the book of Job? Is there an analog in the sense that we would see God in such a way that our contention might move to a place of peace? I'll throw that out for either of you, or both of you, to consider.
I have an answer, but you should pick one of us to go first.
Do you have anything you want to say to that? Dr. Ray's offered a somewhat different interpretation from your own.
Yeah, I think I'll save that.
Okay.
I won't respond to that.
Okay. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so the question is there an analog to seeing God in the way that Job does? I'll tell a story about my wife. My wife, she'll probably get mad at me for this, if this shows up on YouTube or something. So my wife is about to become an associate minister of a church. If you ask her how she got into ministry, the story is something like this. One day, I think when she was in college, she was standing around with a group of guys who were talking about the appropriate place for women in the church. And the appropriate place, according to these guys, was, in the home, not teaching men, things like that. And she said to them, so wait, you mean to tell me that if I were to go to seminary and get an MDiv and try to go into ministry, that would be wrong? They said, yes. And as she tells the story, thus was born her desire to go to seminary. Now I like this story about her, not just because it's a cool story, but you get something of my wife in that story, right? You don't know her in the way that I do, but you know her a little bit. Through the story, you see her a little bit. I think that biblical narratives, and this isn't off the top of my head, there's a whole lot of theory behind this, and I can refer you to books that other people have written. But biblical narratives, I think, and the liturgies of the church can mediate the presence of God to us in ways that it's not quite like being there. And so reading about Job's experience, it's not quite like being there, right? But it mediates that experience in a way that needs to be taken seriously, right? I could try to tell you stories about friends of mine, and in some cases I would falter and I would say, you just had to be there, right? And what I would convey by that is not, of course, you always have to be there because you can't get any experience of a person just from a story, right? That's not what I would convey. We all know that you can get experience of a person mediated through a story. What I convey when I say is that you just had to be there is, on this occasion, I'm failing to mediate that. But some narratives can mediate that. And I think biblical narratives in the liturgies of the church mediate the presence of God. I also take very seriously the biblical idea that the church is the body of Christ. I mean, reflect on that. If you take that, this is what, for those of you who aren't Christians, this is a metaphor. I take it as maybe more than a metaphor. This is a metaphor that's used in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul says the church is the body of Christ, and I take that pretty seriously. The visible presence of Christ on earth is the church. And if you take that seriously, that too is a way in which the presence of God is genuinely mediated to us. It may not be exactly what we want. Often it's not exactly what I want, but whether it's what we want is very different from whether it's the presence of Christ mediated to us.
So I'm going to move us to the last of the three questions before we open it up for questions from the audience. And this question has to do with the prospect of finding meaning or hope in a world where so much suffering exists. And so since we've heard from Dr. Ray recently, I'll shift over to you, Dr. Myers. Can you tell us a bit about, from your perspective, how we might find hope or meaning in a world where there's suffering, how we should think about the prospect of death?
Okay. I'd like to make a distinction here between hope in a world where there is suffering, or meaning, hope and meaning in a world in which there is suffering, and meaning in suffering. I think there's probably hope and meaning in a world where there is suffering, but I want to continue to argue a little bit against the grain of the conversation here that suffering itself is redeemable or has a meaning. So Professor Ray said like three different things that I'm sort of going to try to package together and respond to a little bit. So one thing he said was that it's really sort of the job of the atheoticist to provide evidence of pointless suffering, and that it's sort of going out on a limb to sort of presume that you can say that some suffering is pointless. And then he also said that God owns the suffering. And I think that might be a kind of connected point there. And also then that there's a sort of judgment that the person makes about suffering that might not be a fair judgment in the light of God's, mysterious ways or something to that sort. Well, to me, the answer to that question is to ask the person who's doing the suffering. I mean, that's the access point. That's the entryway. It's not like we can sit here, in our comfort and really make a practical judgment about God's allowing suffering, whether God ought to or ought not to, and whether people's suffering has a point or doesn't have a point. And I take my guide here really from studying the Shoah, the proper name for the Holocaust, which I've been studying now for about the last 5 years. And if you ask the people, who were involved as victims of those criminal acts that the Nazis committed during the Third Reich, I think that you do have some access to some pointless suffering. I think that the Holocaust really shows in an immediate and powerful way that some suffering is disteleological and irredeemable. And I take that because that's what the Jewish people who lived through and live a part of the Shoah as their history say. And I'm not going to say to them, no, your suffering is redeemable because I say so or because my religious tradition says so, even though you think it's not. It has to do with the subject that you're looking at when you're studying the Shoah. You have to look at the two different sides of the subject. One side is the side of the victims, and it's very important to listen to the victims. There's some amazingly beautiful writing that has arisen out of the Shoah. Primo Levi is a great writer. There's some theologians and philosophers that are really great, like Richard Rubinstein after Auschwitz, Emil Fackenheim, To Mend the World. None of these people, Levi, Rubinstein, or Fackenheim, would go for the argument that somehow the suffering of the people who died in the death camps is somehow for a greater good, somehow redeemable, or somehow meaningful in itself. The other half of that subject is the criminals. You know, these were crimes that were committed by human beings, by a whole nation of human beings, really, who used science and technology systematically to put an end to every last person that was Jewish that they could lay their hands on. They went through the closets and the cellars of every European town and city in order to root out every last Jew that they could find so that they could put them to death. Now, we all know that they were successful in doing that to over 6 million, but what we sometimes don't think about is the percentage of that 6 million to the total percentage of Jews that live in the world. You know, if it was 6 million Christians, you know, and there's 600 million Christians, it's still a terrible thing, of course, but, you know, there were only like 14 million Jews in the world. So the Nazis were really successful, you know, in putting to death half the world's populations of Jews. So it seems to me that what you have to do is, I agree that we have to contend with God if we are going to assume the role of a theist. And it seems to me that if we're going to have a theodicy, if we're going to somehow justify God's ways to human beings, that we have to start, you know, with the brute fact of the Shoah. And we have to go ahead and admit that it's really true, that there is no sensible reason that we can fathom why a loving, all-powerful God would allow this. And it's important that we admit that, because if we don't admit that, we are defaming the souls of those people.
Okay, thank you. That's a nice transition to Dr. Ray, and I'm going to pose the same question to you. As a Christian, maybe especially in light of what Dr. Myers has just said, how do you respond to the claim that life is unfair? Life was profoundly unfair for the Jews who died in the Holocaust.
So I do admit that there's no reason that we can fathom why a loving God would permit something like the Holocaust. I want to respond over the course of what I'll say in the next 2 or 3 minutes to this one remark that Professor Myers made to the effect that you can't say to someone who suffered through the Holocaust and who thinks that their suffering is irredeemable that no, in fact, their suffering is redeemable because your religion says so. I think there's a way in which that's right and a way in which that's wrong. But before I explain that, think for a minute about what it would be to find hope and meaning in a world that contains suffering of the sort that our world contains. You might think of our lives as a bunch of stories, right? A bunch of interconnected stories. And I guess thinking of it that way, what it would be to find hope and meaning in a world like ours is to think that somehow all of those stories, many of which are just soaked in suffering, right? Some of which may be so deeply soaked in suffering that seems like the bulk of the life, right? it would be to think that all of those stories could somehow be woven into a larger narrative that is good in itself, and that furthermore makes each one of those individual stories a good story too, right? So that the life of the person who lived it is a great good to him or herself, right? So not just serving greater abstract goods. I take seriously the idea that everyone's life has to ultimately be a great good to him or herself, right? So the question, if you're going to find hope and meaning in a world like ours, is do you think that that can happen, right? Do you think it's possible? It's possible that all these stories be woven together into a larger narrative that's good in itself and that makes each one of the stories also good in itself. Now, I think that the answer is yes, right? Can I say this to someone who's suffered something like the Holocaust? Or heck, just think of my friends. I have friends who've been raped. I have friends who've been beaten by their parents. I have friends who've suffered through divorces. I've had friends who have, perpetrated divorces. I know people who've perpetrated various kinds of abuse. I know all kinds of people who've suffered through all manner of different kinds of things, right? Can I say to those people, your suffering is redeemable? It depends a lot on my relationship to them. What I find interesting is that atheists, and again, Professor Myers is not one, but atheists who talk about the problem of evil quite often are very happy to proclaim that suffering of the type that you have just gone through, whatever your suffering is irredeemable. Well, how would they know, right? You can't tell someone in the midst of suffering that their suffering is redeemable, though, unless you have a very particular relationship with them. For the simple reason that if you don't have the right relationship, you might seem to be trivializing the suffering or doing something worse with it. But when, if my kids come to me, or if my wife comes to me and they've gone through some kind of suffering and they say, I don't see how God can redeem this, at the right time in the right place, it seems like a very good thing to say, well, I think God can. That's encouragement in time of suffering. Again, not just anyone can say that. Maybe that I can't even say that to my own family members. It may be that in this life, the person will never really be able to hear it from anybody. That doesn't make it false that their suffering is redeemable. And it's important to remember too that for everyone's story, except our own, we really only have a fragment of it. You have no idea what all else goes into everyone's life and what comes after this life. So it is really a bold move to say that some bit of suffering is irredeemable. And it's really a bold move, and I think an unfortunate capitulation, to just go ahead and agree with somebody that their suffering is irredeemable. Again, maybe you shouldn't correct them on the spot, and maybe you shouldn't correct them ever. That's a pastoral issue. But just from the point of view of what's true, I'd be reluctant ever to validate that, intellectually speaking.
Okay. So obviously I have a different worldview, a little bit of different worldview. But, and I disagree with you on a few things. But I think I do agree with you on a lot of things. Like, evil is not incompatible with God. Okay. It's not even the case that pointless suffering counts as evidence against. Well, it counts as evidence against the three of God, but it's not conclusive evidence. I'm on board with that. And this is what I'm actually kind of curious about. I hope you kind of spell it out for me. And actually, this kind of, because you both kind of answered in different ways, I'd kind of like to get maybe both of you to talk about this. You argue that you're not in a position to actually judge. You say that you're not in a position to actually evaluate this potential evidence of pointless evil. I guess what I'm wondering, and this sort of makes sense in some regards, because you might say, look, I can't calculate sort of the likelihoods or something like that. But I'm kind of wondering, why doesn't that cut both ways? Because when you talked about why do I go ahead and believe it, you suggested, actually, that when you consider those likelihoods, so to speak, it started to make sense. It's sort of an inference to the best explanation, so to speak. Okay? So I'm kind of curious how you can appeal to sort of skepticism in one case, and yet in another case appeal to inference to the best explanation. Unless, of course, you actually hold that the spin position is something like agnosticism. And perhaps maybe you have pragmatic reasons for actually holding the beliefs that you do. Thanks.
Is this a question for me? Or you said you wanted both of us to...
Yeah, it's mostly to you, but I think I've talked with Dr. Myers a few times. I think he might have something to add too.
Do you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, I think the first part of the question was directed toward you more. I have been attracted to kind of epistemological agnosticism in recent years. It doesn't seem really to me to be oxymoronic even to be called a Christian agnostic. Maybe it's kind of like this, maybe it's unfortunate language, but skeptical theism is a little bit oxymoronic in a way too, I think. But I think that mostly the question was directed toward you because I also was arguing a little bit about that ability to make a judgment.
Yeah, so you asked how I can, on the one hand, appeal to inference to the best explanation, and on the other hand, appeal to skepticism. I guess the short answer is it's with respect to different domains and different questions and all that sort of thing. So if you ask me, consider some particular instance of horrible suffering. Does this instance of suffering have a point? Could it have a point? I would say, I'd say I'm in no position to say that it doesn't have a point. I guess I can infer from the fact that I believe in God that it probably does have a point, right? Nobody's really impressed with that move, but what I would say is I'm not in the right sort of position to be able to tell whether it has a point. So that's one question about a particular case of evil. Does it have a point? Now here's another question. Why would you believe in God? To that, I'd be here a long time, but I guess what I would say is, I've got some of my own religious experiences. I've got the testimony from lots of other people about their religious experiences. I've got a variety of arguments for the existence of God, historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. And sort of on my experience of what it's like to be in church and what it's like to read the Bible and all this sort of thing. No one bit of which is by any means decisive, but when you put it all together, the best explanation of all of it, to my mind, is that the Christian story is true. And it's just evaluating a different proposition with a different body of evidence.
Can I possibly follow up briefly?
We probably should.
Okay, no, that's fine.
But I will encourage you to, we don't have to get these two home anytime in particular, so you can follow up. But I do want to give other people a chance to ask the questions.
Okay, thank you. So most of this discussion has been about the, as it were, unknowable evil that we can't identify any purpose for. Okay, well, it happens that I've been reading Daniel a fair amount recently, and there's a lot of description of evil that is maybe not Holocaust, but equivalent over many generations of persecution that the Jews went through, okay, under many regimes, etc. And at one point, God sends an angel, and he tells them that, and this happens in other places in the Bible, that he tells them that that kind of the reason is so that you would turn back to me. And that's paraphrased, concise version. But so anyway, the point being that God describes the reason for some what we would maybe consider unimaginable suffering in the Bible, and he gives a specific reason. My question is, and I suppose this is mostly for Dr. Myers, because you had the most objection, I guess, but if we, and assuming that we accept God's explanation for why this happened to them, can we interpolate that maybe the Holocaust was just similar events, maybe also had a purpose in God's eyes?
Well, it's a really well-formulated question, and it's a tough one. The kinds of explanations that God gives in the Bible, as in Daniel, I think are in need of interpretation. Well, let's see, I don't know how to come down on this. I don't want to agree. I'll start with my basic gut reaction to the question. I don't want to agree that God at some point will reveal to his people the meaning of the Holocaust. I would even go along with those Jewish authors that say that God broke the covenant rather than go along with the idea that there's some inner meaning or some deeper meaning to the Holocaust.
So no.
Right.
This is kind of a question for both of you, but how do you found the idea that people have used religious texts in the past to convey evil, such as using the Bible to commit slavery or against women's rights?
You want to go first? Or you want me to?
I want to address it, but I don't care whether why don't you can go first?
Okay. I think humans have a terrific capacity for misusing texts, especially ones that are difficult to interpret. I had a church history professor who said repeatedly, the Bible is not a children's book. And that's true. I mean, it's a difficult book to understand. And it's one that's been abused by a lot of people. And what I would say about these cases is these are cases in which it's been abused. And we can identify lots and lots of others too. And in the end, that is just another case of evil and suffering that it's hard to know why God permits it, right? But it's no harder or easier to know why God would permit that than to know why God permits a whole wide range of other evils and instances of suffering.
Okay, so I'm teaching a course this semester on liberation theology. And we're looking at womanist theology, and we're looking at black theology and Latina theology. And these are theologians that are willing to face those kinds of issues that you're raising, like the use of the Bible to defend slavery or something like that. And the first thing and I think this goes along a little bit with what I said earlier about an ethical system that kind of runs parallel to what's taught in the Bible. You sort of have to have this circle, I think. You get creative ideas about what's right and wrong from the Bible, but you also have to judge the Bible in light of what your moral intuitions say. And you not only judge the Bible, but I think that it's proper to come to some different kinds of images and understandings of who God might be. So in liberation theology, you know, James Cone said Christ is black. And in womanist theology, Monica Coleman says Christ is a black woman. And I think it's very valuable, actually, to think in these kinds of terms. So that's the theological part. But the practical part is, you know, it's true that we've been having a kind of academic discussion about, you know, God and evil. But the point of it really should be is how do we respond to suffering? And in that, I think the basic lessons of the world's religious traditions, including the Bible, is pretty clear. It's how do we care for those who are most in need, the marginalized? How do we express an option for the poor, is the way liberation theology puts it. The Hebrew scripture, the Old Testament, said that we ought to take care of the poor, the widowed, and the orphan. You know, it kind of issues forth in some pretty clear, you know, moves that we ought to make. But I do think that your question really implies that we have not just the right, but even the duty to reinterpret these texts as we move along in light of our contemporary ethical knowledge of things.
Thank you.
I have a question that I hope both of you can respond to, and it regards suffering of non-human animals. And I was just curious, Dr. Myers, if you think that certain forms of suffering of non-human animals, like industrial farming in wealthy nations, could be considered pointless suffering? And for Dr. Ray, I'd just like you to speak more about where the suffering caused to non-human animals, but also by non-human animals to other non-human animals. That suffering fits within the Christian theology and morality and evil.
Well, my answer is a quick yes. That's a very nice move you made to connect pointless suffering with what some animals in farming might be undergoing.
Yeah, this is a difficult problem that a lot of people who work on, well, a lot, that people who work on the problem of evil are turning their attention to. I mean, I guess in the end, my thought about that is, you know, I'm a human being, right? And I can't even begin to imagine why God might permit the sorts of sufferings that human beings undergo, right? So I'm going to have even less of a clue why God might permit the sorts of sufferings that non-human animals undergo. I mean, I don't know what the qualitative experience for a non-human animal is. I don't know what sorts of goods are available really to non-human animals in this life or in the next. So I'm already stymied by the problem of trying to figure out God's reasons for permitting suffering to humans. But in the end, the story about that, or the consequences of that for my belief in God are ultimately the same, right? I mean, I'm not in a position to say that it definitely serves no point. I'm not in a position to say that it couldn't be redeemed or anything like that, right?
I'm just wondering, Dr. Myers, particularly for you, could you discount the, as a reason for suffering, personal growth on a personal level and a community level, seeing as lessons are learned and people tend to change through suffering?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. Those are very useful things that sometimes do come out of suffering. I was looking at the thesis that I wrote in 1981, just before I came over to the hall here, and I had addressed the Holocaust even then. And I said that the Holocaust did issue forth into some good things. And the things that I mentioned in 1981 were justice at Nuremberg and the creation of the State of Israel. And I happen to believe personally that those are both good things that issued forth from the Holocaust. But that doesn't really take away from the point that I was making before, that the suffering that occurred in the Holocaust itself cannot be paid for by those good things that issued forth from it.
Dr. Ray, this question is directed at you, but Dr. Myers, if you have a response, that's fantastic. My question has to do with free will. If there aren't events of pointless suffering, then how do you address the subject of free will? Or can someone avoid an event of suffering that is not pointless in any way, or is it a part of a higher purpose? So I guess, yeah, does free will exist in relation to no events of pointless suffering?
Free will is a philosophically painful topic. So let's just suppose that we have free will, right? I mean, I appeal to that. And let's set aside some of the hard questions about how free will is even possible. And now the question is basically this. And tell me if I get you right, but I take it the question is this. Suppose my suffering does serve a higher purpose. Well, that's a purpose that was established presumably before the foundations of the world, right? It's hard to imagine that God just kind of makes up these higher purposes as we all go along, right? But if my suffering serves some higher purpose that was established before the foundation of the world, what could I possibly have done to avoid it? Right? Is this basically the worry?
More or less, yeah.
Yeah. I guess assuming we have this kind of free will, I think what I want to say is one option we have to take seriously is that it's not that God established from the foundation of the world that things must go in a particular way. Rather, what happened is something like this. God started at the very beginning, so to speak, knowing what everybody would freely do in whatever circumstances they might find themselves in. And God has placed, God sort of created the world, set up the initial conditions, intervened judiciously here and there, and so on, in such a way that we can count on God, having known what everyone would freely do in whatever circumstances they're placed in. God has set things up so that he can bring good out of anything that he knows ultimately is going to happen, right? And so the way you got to understand this established before the foundations of the world talk is it's not as if God sat down and said, so-and-so has to do things precisely this way, and I'm going to bring it about that so-and-so does that, i.e. I'm going to determine that so-and-so does that. Rather, God thought something like, I know what all these folks will freely do in whatever circumstances I place them in, and I'm going to cooperate with them to bring about a world in which all suffering is ultimately redeemed or defeated.
I just hold two sorts of things, I guess. First, I hold that we are morally responsible, whether or not you want to cash that out in some kind of theory of freedom. And second, I think I hold that God doesn't have the whole world planned out. I have a kind of more open concept of the relationship of God to the world. That might be because I'm under the influence of process philosophy in this seminar right now, so I reserve the right to change that maybe later on.
still yes, Dr. Rick. You said earlier that the Bible is a difficult book. So I'm just wondering, why did God give us a difficult book? My second question is, if there is a point to evil, why do Christians work so hard to help God to correct evil through justice? If there is a point to evil, He's going to fix it after all.
Yeah, those are good questions. As to why God gave us a difficult book, I don't know. That's basically my line with respect to evil and suffering. And yet, you can construe the difficulty of Scripture as just another instance of the problem of evil, right? I can speculate. One of my colleagues said on some other occasion, in response to a similar question, that maybe just the Bible certainly has, it's done a lot of good in the world, and it has captivated the attention of, the smartest scholars humanity has ever produced. And it is also the sort of book that can be taught to, 2- and 3-year-olds in children's Sunday schools, all over the place. That's a remarkable text. It might be that a simple user's manual or something like that would not, indeed, could not have captivated the attention of human beings in the way that the Bible has. That's a speculative answer. I don't want to place a lot of stock in it, but I find that kind of plausible. The other question: if evil has a point, why do we try to avoid it? It might be that the evils that we avoid are such that had they occurred, they wouldn't have had a point. Right? There's that. That's sort of a cheap answer. The answer I prefer is we're told to do that, and it's good to do that. God's position with respect to us is a different position than our position with respect to one another. Right? I expect my children to relate to one another in ways different from how I relate to them. Right? And I expect them to treat one another in ways that I don't expect myself to treat them. Because I'm their dad, and they are each other's siblings, right? And God, knowing all that God knows and having the capacities that God has a right to let me suffer for a greater good. Knowing what little you know and having in relation to God the capacities that you have, don't have the same right. And so I guess that's what I want to say about that.
Can I respond? I'd like to say first that I think it's not that useful to think of the Bible as a book that God gave us, but I'd rather think of it as a book that we wrote thinking about God. And second, I think whether evil, suffering is pointless or not pointless, I don't think we're going to come to agreement on that tonight. But in either case, I think justice is the issue. We have a duty to be just to one another, whether or not suffering has a point or doesn't.
So this is kind of an open-ended question for either of you, but it seemed like a major theme of tonight's discussion was this distinction between redeemable suffering and just teleological suffering, with this position that as long as the good ultimately resulting from suffering outweighs the evil immediately resulting from it, then that suffering isn't troubling to us, that it doesn't take away from the benevolence of the God. So my question is, morally speaking, does this imply a principle that we could have a good end justifying some evil need? That it's okay to understand that a God can commit evil acts with the ultimate goal of some higher good. And that would sort of, using God as a moral high example, extend to us in our morality.
You want to go first, or do you want me to?
Well, I think that's a question for you. I don't think I really have that question.
I'd want to make a distinction first between God committing evil acts and permitting suffering. I don't think God commits evil acts. I do think that God permits suffering. And I think that God can permit suffering for greater goods. At least in the case where the goods come to the people who suffer. Right? It's not so clear that God would be justified in permitting me to suffer horrendously for your goods, say, or for the goods of, the cosmos or something like that. But I think God can permit me to suffer for my own good. And, this is something that we do with our children all the time, right? We allow them to suffer all kinds of things for their own good. We take them to get painful shots and things like that, right? So we're acquainted with the concept of letting someone suffer for the sake of a greater good. Again, especially when the good comes to the person who suffers. There is another point, though, in response to what you're saying. I've been trying to figure out a way to work this in, but I haven't seen a way until the first part of what you said here. A lot of the discussion has focused on the question whether God could permit suffering for the sake of a greater good, and what that means for the problem of evil, and what it means for the problem of evil if we can't detect the greater goods, and so on. And the question I think that it's important to ask as you think about the problem of evil is, suppose you knew, take the worst suffering you've undergone, and we've all undergone something really bad, right? So take the thing that pains you the most, and ask yourself, suppose you knew the point for which God permitted that. Would that satisfy you? I mean, I think I actually do know in broad outline the point for which God has permitted my sufferings. It's something like this. Either the world's a better place or I'm better off for it. Right? That's the reason. And this is a reason that pretty much every Christian ultimately thinks that they're in possession of for the sufferings that they've undergone too. Everybody who's a Christian thinks that they have some idea, really, why they've been allowed to suffer. They just don't know all the details. But would further detail really help? I don't think it would in my case. The sufferings I've undergone, if God came and said, well, here exactly is the good that contributes to, I don't think I'd say, oh yeah, okay, that's all totally fine then. I didn't really mind that. And that, to me, suggests that the whole question of what the point is really misplaced. I think even though I acknowledge that there's an interesting philosophical problem here and so on and so forth, I think the problem of evil that bugs us, the one that lingers after you've seen come to believe that, yeah, there's no logical argument against the existence of God from the fact of suffering. And yeah, we're not in a position really to say that these sufferings are pointless. The problem that lingers is just, this was awful. We don't like that it happened, and God wasn't there to comfort us, right? And it's frustrating that God's not there to comfort us, and that's sort of a separate problem that's interesting and difficult to deal with in its own right. But I think that's the thing that lingers. In the end, if we knew the point, I don't think that would help. And so in a certain way, I think that a lot of the focus on what the point of suffering might be is misplaced. If you knew, it wouldn't help you. What bugs you is something else.
Okay, I think we'll do one more question, and then we're going to start to wrap things up for tonight. So anybody else?
So I have a couple of questions and a comment in between. First of all, in your responses, you both seem to state either directly or indirectly that the presence of suffering does not deny God, the existence of God. But I do not really hear a case for God or a support for God. To add to that question, I believe that a lot of people have different worldviews and religions and even positions on whether God exists or doesn't exist. How does your responses tonight really serve to support the fact that there is a God, one, and make a case specifically for the Christian God? Because I'm not sure I really got that. So that's my first. The second is, from the examples that have been kind of focused on tonight, there is so much of the emphasis on the Holocaust. And you kind of hinted at the beginning of your comments about, human perfection of sin. And I thought I would hear more of that because it seemed like as the discussion went on, there was digression from human responsibility and how we are responsible for our actions, and almost like taking away the responsibility or the blame of, the detrimental effects that we see in the world today from humans and placing it on God. So I was kind of lost at that, but more interestingly to me is the reality of natural disasters, the tsunamis that comes on people without even anybody, any corrupt official or person doing anything against the other. How do we reconcile that in view of God and the God of the Bible?
Want me to go? Sure. All right. First question: what's the case for God's existence? Do you have another hour? Really, that wasn't. So what we were doing tonight is discussing a prima facie case against God's existence, namely the case that could be made from the fact of suffering. So neither one of us have been trying to argue for the conclusion that God exists. And to do that really would be, it would just be a whole another discussion. I mentioned why I believe that God exists. It's got a lot to do with my own personal religious experiences, which are, low grade and few and far between. It's not like I've had deep mystical experiences, but, testimony of the religious experiences of others, testimony from the Bible, which strikes me as true, various arguments for the existence of God, arguments from the complexity and design in the universe, and things like that, historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. It's a whole bunch of different things, and to lay it all out in detail really would be a long discussion. The other question: what does one make of natural disasters? How do you reconcile the existence of natural disasters with the existence of God? Again, in the end, reconciling the existence of natural disasters with the existence of God just comes to, figuring out whether you can reconcile it comes just to this question, I think. Is it possible that all of these individual stories that are our lives, some of which include suffering the effects of natural disasters, is it possible that all of these can be woven into a narrative that is, on the whole, a good narrative? And a narrative, furthermore, according to which all of those individual stories are good stories. If that's possible, then a benevolent God could bring about a world in which those things happen. If that's not possible, then a benevolent God couldn't be. According to Christianity, not only is it possible, it's actual. That, God exists and God has brought about a world in which human beings live lives that are soaked in suffering, and yet somehow all of this suffering is redeemed and defeated, and the work of Jesus on the cross is somehow an important piece of the entire puzzle. That's what the Christian story puts forward for our consideration and for our belief. And it's got a lot going for it, even though we can't see all the details. And in the end, I can't see any reason to think that, at least on the score of whether it's possible that all this suffering get redeemed, I can't see any reason to think that it's impossible.
The question was stated so beautifully that I don't want to mess with it too much, but I would like to say something about the part of the question that asked about the emphasis on the Holocaust. And my belief is that great instances of evil, like the Holocaust, are kind of sui generis, is that the term? That is, that they each have their own unique features. I didn't mean to pick out the Holocaust as the only or the most important example of evil that human beings have undergone or perpetrated against one another. There are many, many genocides, different historical events that we could choose, but each one seems to have its own kind of unique features, and they're not, you have to be a little careful when you compare them, because that can demean the experience of one group over another group, and I wanted to avoid that.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.